poets. Lahore in the Ghaznavid's time came to be known as the smaller Ghazna because of the continued migration of Persian scholars and escalation of the poetics works. Poets like Masood Sa Sal Hijra, Nadara Aija, Nalehu Kahe Lageu Chatiya. This blend, as we see here, Zehal Miskin Makun Tagaful is in Persian. Dorai Naina Banai Batiya is in Hindi. Kitab Hijra, Nadara Meja, Persian, and again the next is Hindi. This blend of two languages in this poem and Khusro's initiation created a new poetic style which not only helped Persian to grow in the South Asian milieu but also garnered admiration of its literature and poetry. Such works not only attracted the locals but also gained popularity with what Marshall Hodgson termed as Persianate world. Simultaneously, the exchange of Persian literature from different regional domains continued. As Richard Eaton mentioned, as the subset of trans-regional flows, Persian texts and Persian speakers circulated throughout West, Central, and South Asia from 11th century in expanding and increasing dense network. Artisans, mercenaries, Sufis, sheikhs, slaves, poets, scholars, pilgrims, and merchants all traveled along the maritime and overland routes throughout that both undergirded and constituted the Persian world. With the onset of Mughals, they helped legalize this currency of new language. Not only was this a medium of exchange for literature, but also gained an official status. In 14th century, there was an attempt to include Hindi speakers to understand the Mughal courts and administration. This saw the emergence of word books which is known as nisabs. These nisabs helped in building the collaboration between the acquaintance of Persian courts and non-Persian speakers. So nisabs were basically the Persian equivalents for Hindi terms. When we come to the Akbar's time, during the Akbar's reign, he is considered to be the harbinger of Persian literature and promotion of the Persian and Persian language and literature. Muzaffar Alam mentions how Abul Fazl was seen iterating the rules of the language and curriculum in Ain-e-Akbari. Ain-e-Akbari, he mentions how the children were encouraged to learn Persian and they were encouraged to memorize the Persian couplets. That was the priority back then when Akbar came to the reign. Akbar's era saw many historical works and prominent poets such as Ain-e-Akbari by Abul Fazl, Muntakab-ul-Tariq by Badiun, and poets like Faizi, the brother of historian Abul Fazl. Urfi Shirazi was another. The successor of Akbar, Nuruddin Muhammad Salim, popularly known as Jahangir, was himself a recognized poet of his times. Jahangir's considerable amount of personal knowledge can be seen in his autobiography Tuzuk-e-Jahangiri. In poetry, both Persian and Urdu. Jahangir's elder grandson Dara Shikoh was another in the line to carry forward this legacy. When we come to I won't talk much about Dara Shikoh as Dr. Amit has already explained much. It was so enlightening. But when we come to the last Mughal dynasty, what we consider to be the last, Bahadur Shah Zafar's reign, apart from being a versatile poet and patron of the Persian literature, he also initiated change in what was back then a mushaira culture, a symposium, a poetic symposium, what it was called. And the change came to be known as Tahri Mushaira. So Tahri Mushaira was a mushaira where one verse of the couplet is pre-established and the poets were ought to use the same verse that was established verse in every line, in every couplet. The accumulation of poetry increased the poetic influence of Persian started seeping into the Urdu poetry. Though mushairas were meant for Urdu poetry, but this was heavily burdened with Persian words, styles, and poetics. The prominent poets of 18th to 20th century possessed proficiency in both Persian and Urdu poetry. Mir Taqi Mir compiled an autobiography called Kulliyat-e-Mir in Persian. Ghalib took more pride in his Persian rather than Urdu, although scholars find his Urdu works more assertive to his pride. Mohammed Iqbal is the newest in the line of the Persian poets par excellence from the subcontinent. Out of 11 of his total publications, 7 were Persian. The three pioneers, Mir, the Khuda Sukhan as we know him, god of poetry, Ghalib Dabirul Mulk, what was given by Bahadur Shah Zafar, Iqbal Sher-e-Mashriq, still stands tall in this cosmopolis of South Asian Persian poetry. The transition of Persian poetry from medieval to modern is majorly credited to its literary abundance of the past. The Persian knowledge production saw a low in its popularity and demand in the early 19th century. Although Persian's influence on Urdu poetry remained intact and the domain of the poetry was captured by Urdu, the decline of the Persian language in early stages of British colonization was brought out when the British East India Company revoked its official status in 1835. At the same time, Raja Ram Mohan Roy Persian newspaper Miratul Akhbar can be seen as a strong rebuttal against British ruling, thereby trying to preserve the language in the public domain. Although the space that Persian literature had carved for itself was not to be dissolved easily, broadcasting media adopted Persian works from the past, films showcasing old Persian tales like Layle Majnu, Wa Ali Baba Wa Chahel Duzd, or as it popularly known as Ali Baba Chalis Chor or Ali Baba and 40 Thieves, are the few instances where overarching Persian influence in South Asia can be observed. The narrative undergoes a significant change with the introduction of internet. A wide range of Persian literature got archived. Persian works, due to its abundance, saw a pace in its digital archiving. Simultaneous research works also helped in integrating the process. These works started spreading globally via internet. Enormous reach and specific choices helped the digital restoration of to classify and divide the works in specific eras and genres. Focusing on the ongoing development, the place it has reached now can be seen in the number of avenues worth exploring that it has opened up. Years of collection helped restore the rarest of the Persian manuscripts, lithographs, books, and so on. Same as happened with the poetry. Sites like Ganjur, Rira, Persian literature, Dorj are some of the examples.
There are about 5 more minutes. Please try and wind up.
Okay, sure. When we come to Instagram, as we see, when we come to Instagram, as throughout the above mentioned paper, the part that I have tried to show the Persian along with the poetry survived in a historical transition throughout the exploring its avenues. Now the Persian poetry on Instagram and the amalgamation has led to what is known as transliteracy, which refers to the ability to read, write, and interact across the wide ranges of platforms, tools, and media, broadcasting medias, and digital social medias. This transliteracy around the Persian poetry has also helped to garner cross-border viewership in South Asia. The slide which is shown here is an example of a transliteracy, and it's an example of a multimodal transliteracy. So basically, the figure 1, which is showing a poem by Manto Shudam to Manshudi. It's a poem by Amir Khusro. Manto Shudam to Manshudi, Mantan Shudam to Jan Shudi, Takas Nagoyat Badas in Mandi Garam to Dugari. So the first figure shows the Persian code, the second figure shows the English translation, the third figure shows the English transliteration, and the fourth figure shows the audio recitation of the same. When this is another example. Here, it's not only in Persian, it's not only in English transliteration what we see, it's also in Hindi transliteration, it's also in Hindi translation, and again, it comes in English translation and Urdu translation. So The above images are example of the multimodal post and how they carry out the things. The paper has intended to map a journey of the Persian language literature, though giving all these images is basically to map the comparison between how it's breaking the prerequisites to understand the Persian poetry and how it's very easy. The onset of Instagram pushed its heights by easy structural layout, precise contents, and more audience. This space has tried to build up social media vernacular, which helps the South Asian followers to connect and realize their own very past, Persian past. The social media vernacular has not only provided education but also built up a space where Persian is not anymore a simple language for elites producing canonical literatures, but has become available for a common audience too. Transliterations and translations have surpassed all the prerequisites of knowing the language and helped in democratizing the poetics into the discursive audience. Though there are Instagram pages, there are less Instagram pages which is dealing with the Persian poetry right now in the South Asian milieu. But the pace in which this South Asia seems to gain consciousness of the Persian self might result in educating and establishing the original base where translations would not require would not be required to convey the meaning of the poetry. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shubham, for that very interesting presentation, which draws out a trajectory of Persian poetry in India as well as the contemporary scene on Instagram, etc. I was mute when I had to introduce Shubham. Shubham is studying MA in Persian in JNU from the Center of Language and Literature and Cultural Studies. So thank you, Shubham. Our next presenter is
Thank you.
Hari Krishnan R, who will be talking about architectural poetics, a case study of Trikuna Sasta Kshetram. So, welcome, Hari Krishnan. Please keep to your time, about 15 minutes, so that we can have a 5-minute window for a discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, one and all. So, at the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present a paper at your esteemed conference. So, my paper is titled Architectural Poetics, a study of Trikuna Shasta Kshetram. So, from the very beginning, I would like to say that the paper might not confer to the larger thematic schema of the conference, but please stay with me. I'm sure that I'll be able to do justice to the larger theme that is mentioned in the conference as I'm explaining my presentation. So I plan to begin by giving an introduction to this regional polity called Onatera or Odanade, which is the area where this temple is located. So as of now in the session, we've dealt largely with Persian literature. So I think it is upon me to take you to a diametrically opposite Sanskritic world. So as the session is rightfully titled in the Sanskrit and Persian cosmopolis, I would like to present to you my paper. So before we begin, I'm going to present my presentation. Pardon me, I'm trying to present my presentation. Give me a second. It's not granting me permission to present my presentation. Give me a second. I'll just quickly log out and log in. Can you all hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Uh, Right. So the paper is titled Architectural Poetics, a case study of Trikuna Shastra Kshetra. The period from the 11th to the 17th century was a period of political unrest throughout the state of Kerala after the decline of the unifying power of the Perumals. The entirety of the state became a landmass of feuding chieftains, and thus innumerable principalities with local feuding governments arose under several Naduvari. Onatagara or Odnadu too had its inception during this time. And as the political unrest settled and solidified rose to power over the first few centuries as the regional power to reckon, strong enough to support and back other neighboring powers like Deshinadu. Odnadu was one among several principalities that came into prominence between the 11th and the 17th century. After the disintegration of the Cheras of Mahodepuram or Makotai, it consists of the present-day taluks of Karthikapalli and Mavelikara in Alappuzha district, Karunapalli in Kollam district, and a small part of Tiruvalla taluk in Pathanamthitta district of the state of Kerala. It was bordered on the north by Trikunapura Swarupam and Chibagasheri, on the south by Deshinganadu, on the east by Pandaram Deshaveri, and Tekkungur on the west by the vast expanse of the Arabian Sea. Odnadu was also known as Shirava Swarupam and is mentioned in the Tripunithra records. Medieval literature, the Champu, Manipravalam, and Sandeshkavya traditions like Unniniri Sandesham, Unni Adicharitam, Harikshamasa Samarotsavam, or Kandiur Mattam Padapate, and Shiva Vilasam gives importance to the region of Odnadu. Though Odnadu was first considered as a feudatory of the Kochi dynasty, its leanings and political relations were towards the Deshinganadu royalty of Kollam than the former. This is attested by the accounts of Duarte Barbosa, the Portuguese traveller who had visited southern Kerala in 1514 CE. He notes the Kayankulam was a subsidiary branch of Jayasimhanadu and came to be known in subsequent foreign records as Kollikoilam. After the decline of Cherava in the 15th century, the capital of Odnadu was transferred from Kandiur first to Eruva near Kayankulam and then finally to Krishnapuram. The Krishnapuram palace had become the military base of the Odnadu kings by the end of the century. The long battles of Odnadu against Vaynadu between 1731 to 1746 were fought from this base. Ever since the transfer of its capital city to Kayankulam, the Odnadu king came to be known as the Kayankulam dynasty. The 16th and 17th centuries were a period of political unrest and turmoil for Odnadu. The long battles against Vaynadu depleted the kingdom of its resources and eventually its sovereignty. Between 1731 and 1746, Kayankulam engaged in three major battles with Vaynadu as part of its northward expansion. Marthandavarma first attacked Kayankulam in 1734 CE. Though Kayankulam showed its initial resistance to the southern army, successive battles with the Vaynadu troops had rendered their resistance powerless over the following years. Thus, by 1746, Kayankulam had ceased to exist as an independent kingdom, as now the northern frontier of Marthandavarma's Thiruvidampur kingdom. Now, this a historical understanding of the city of Kayankulam is also quite germane to talking about the particular temple that I've taken up for my study. Kayankulam has been described by historians as an ancient port city. Medieval Manipravan texts like Unnunili Sandesham and Harikshamasa Samarotsam, the particular text that I will be basing my study also on, contain detailed accounts of the markets and businesses surrounding Kayankulam. There were Gauda Saraswats, Christians, Ravaris, Eurasians, etc. among the readers of the markets of Kayankulam. I'm quoting Mr. Shibushan. Though they maintained close ties with both the Portuguese and Dutch traders, in time the Dutch emerged as close allies of the Kayankulam royalty. The relations were strengthened when the Dutch ambassador, Captain John Nieuwhof, visited Kayankulam and signed several trade agreements. As per the agreements, they were allowed to build warehouses at Cheriyarikal and Trikunapura. The agreement also gave the Dutch monopoly over the trade in pepper. In return, Kayankulam acquired advanced machinery in warfare like the Dutch guns and gunpowder. By the 18th century, 1/5 of the total 20 lakh pound pepper that the Dutch bought from Kerala every year was entirely from Kayankulam. Though Kayankulam lacked its own port for the maritime trade, pepper was brought in from the eastern hills and the hinterlands by the many rivers and backwaters. There were provisions to transport pepper from Kayankulam to the ports of Koilum and Purakkad via inland waterways. It is this pluralistic setting that I attempt to read into the temple culture of this region as having indelible influence on shaping Onatara's cultural contours. A locality prone to interactions with diverse cultural groups inevitably retains some aspects of such foreign influxes. The temple as an institution was also not free from such exchanges, as can be illustrated from the example I have taken up for my detailed study in this paper. Toward this, I will make use of the text Harikshmasa Samrotsam or Kandiur Mattam Padapatta, supposedly written by Cheppugada Neelakantan between 1550 to 1650, edited by K. Sambashiva Shatri, and published along with the Trivandrum Sanskrit series by the Oriental Research Institute and Manuscripts Library, Trivandrum. In doing so, I attempt to exploit the interdisciplinary potential of approaching the space of our built environment from perspectives of language, poetry, and poetics, or in other words, architectural poetics. Harikshmasa Samrotsavam. As the title of the work suggests, it is a celebration of the mock fights conducted during the month of Chingam in the Onondaga region, a region which is known for having conducted warfare throughout the year. Celebrating mock fights at special occasions during the year was quite innate to the culture of that landscape. Written in the Pata tradition, highly influenced by Maniprawalam poetry, the work is written as an exchange between a beetle and a parrot narrating in detail the people and the land of Ornad, set to celebrate the mock fights after the yearly harvest in Chingam. The Pata begins with a detailed description of the exchanges in local markets that have come into being owing to the celebration. Apart from detailing the goods bought and sold in trade, it also describes the people who visit these marketplaces, including European traders. It then goes on to describe the preparatory rites for the celebrations followed by the actual mock fight itself. The lines, ഓണയുദ്ധങ്ങൾ ചെയ്തു ആണുങ്ങൾ കഴകെന്നും നാണയം പലകൊണ്ടെന്നത് വിലത്തോർക്കൾക്കെല്ലാം ചേരമാൻ കാലത്തിലെ പാരിലുള്ളവർക്ക് മോക്ഷം ചേരുവാനുള്ള കർമ്മം നേരെയുള്ളതിൽ തന്നെ വീരന്മാർ നിരൂപിച്ചാൽ വീരരസങ്ങൾ ചെയ്താൽ വീര്യസ്വർഗം പോവാൻ പാരമില്ലെന്ന് കണ്ടാർ. Eulogies men who take part in the mock fights. Visual representation of the same can be found within the precincts of the temple proper that I have taken up for analysis. Trikuna Shastra Temple, a formalistic study. Believed to be the site of the fabled Sri Mulavasan, the Trikuna Shastra Temple is considered to be the Hinduized form of an erstwhile Buddhist monastery. Atula's Mushika Vamsha mentions the dike built by King Vikramarama to protect Sri Mulavasan from being eroded by the sea. The Palian copper plate in Bhakti of the King Vikramaditya Varaguna also mentions the land grants made to the Buddhist monastery that existed here. The temple most likely came to be constructed in the area after the monastery perished in the 11th century. The complex also has a Muruga temple, which according to legends predates the Shastra temple, but which is stylistically similar to the 16th century Haripadi Subramania temple. The temple is located in Trikunapura Panchayat of Arapura district, the present Duranma rests with the Ayyappa Seva Sangam. Until 1973, the temple was under the ownership of Edapalli Surupam. P.G. Rajendran has noted that there is a stone inscription detailing the installation of the Moola Devada in the main temple as on the 27th of Meenam Asterix in the Malayalam month of Makara. The chief deity is here unlike any other in Kerala temples. Though worshipped in the Sankalpa of Shastra, it does not have the iconographic features usually attributed to the deity. Sculpted in stone and covered in Panchaloha by a process known as Varthakettuka, the central idol is not single freestanding image. In fact, it's a cluster of three forms, that of a man and a woman in sitting Sukhasana posture and a child standing between the two, sculpted on a single piece of stone. Some scholars are of the opinion that the three are Shasta along with his wife Prabha and son Satika, whereas others who believe that it is a Buddhist image are of the opinion that it is Buddha along with his wife Yashodhara and Rahula. The images are situated on a raised platform and only the male image is directly visible through the Garbhagriha. The cluster of images facing east has not been consecrated by the rules of Shadadhara Pradishta and as such poses an interesting problem. The temple treatise dealing with the consecration rituals like the Tantra Samuchaya and Ishana Shiva Gurudeva Pattadi underline the importance of Shadadhara Pradishta of the Moola Devada. It will therefore have to be seen as to how a freestanding image came to be placed within the Garbhagriha of worship and what necessitated the overlooking of prescriptive text in the worship of a central deity here. The temple is located in a square prakara with opening to all four cardinal directions from the middle of each side, thereby conferring to the Sarvatovadra type of temple plan. Sri Koil is not exactly square-shaped and is rectangular, keeping in practice with the architectural convention of Shastra temples in Kerala. The Adhisthana in stone has the usual moldings of Padma, Paduga, Jagadi, Tripada, Pumada, Gala, Galapatta and Vedi. The Pranala in stone is rather simple with fluted shaft emerging from a little above to the Galapatta of the Adhisthana in the northern side of Sri Koil. It is held over by the head of Bodhagana in Tribhanga position, standing inside a stone basin. The plain walls made in laterite stone show limited moldings like Ghanadwara, Prastara and Bhadras. The opening dwara is devoid of any dwara palakas. However, stone dwara, Bharvaga Ganas on either side of the doorway suggests the presence of these at some point in time. That's not in the picture. There is a beautiful mural painting of an Ugra Narasimha killing and ripping apart the entrails of dead Hiranyakashipu laid on his lap, occupying much of the western wall. This is most probably a late 16th century mural painting. There is an inner circumambulatory path known as the Madhyanadi or an Antarala Mandalam, thereby making it a Santara temple. The Sopana balustrade in stone has 5 flights of steps leading up to the Mukhamandapa. A square Namaskara Mandapa with Adhisthana in stone showing the usual moldings of the Sri Koil have 4 Brahmakanta columns supporting its roof. The Navakandam in wood under the roof of the Balkalpura is unique in that all the cardinal deities are represented as women as opposed to the common male deities. The 9 deities have clearly defined breasts and are portrayed as emerging out of blooming lotuses. The entablature and rafters in wood here carry motifs of warriors and depict war scenes, apart from the Palari Madhana sequence, which you can see to the left of the slide, that particular photograph towards the bottom of it. It is interesting to note that some of these warriors have the attire of European mercenary with helmets and armors, though stylistically belong to the miniature woodwork prototype of Kerala. Now, these are these images. You will find it towards the bottom of the entablature of the Namaskara Mandapam to the temple. These are again carved in the same typical Keralite manner of wood carving that is practiced within temples, but the adornment that goes into the making of these figurines are quite different as opposed to the nativized forms that one can find on temple walls, and which is why it piqued an interest in me while I was doing my field work. It is interesting to know that some of these warriors have the attire of European mercenary with helmets and armors, though stylistically belong to the miniature woodwork prototype of Kerala. Their attire is highly reminiscent of Dutch soldiers during the medieval times. As such, I infer them to be visual representation of Dutch soldiers stationed in the area, engaged not only in warfare, but also as standing army guarding Dutch possession in the region. Thus, it is interesting to note how the morphological aspects of a temple complex come to inform the public that it serves with concrete visualization of not only metaphysical concepts of the divine, but also historical markers indicative of quotidian life. Temples that arose as centers of worship to a personalized god or Ishtadevata naturally took on several other roles during its development in the kind of complexes we see today. As is exemplified in the works of historians like Keshavan Vidatha, Rajan Gurukul, etc., temples evolved to become judicial and economic institutions that had a huge impact upon the society whose religious need it took care of. They came to be vested with regal status and came to sanction the power of the royalty in view of royal patronage and security. By the medieval times, temples began to be patrons of not only visual arts, but of performing arts as well as literature and other fine arts. However, the arrival of the colonial forces set in motion entities that permeated even the heart of insulated orthodoxic religious institutions like temples. The Trikuna temple, a focal point of northern Karnataka, in this respect bear clear markers of early modernity in the many artworks that adorn the temple complex. As such, an analysis of these materials is pertinent to our understanding of the various components that form the totality of what we term today as temple culture, and which played a definitive role in the formation of feudal society up until the 17th century Kerala in general and Odanadu in particular. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hari Krishnan. Hari Krishnan is pursuing his PhD in visual arts from School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. So that was a very interesting panel in which all the 3 presenters are from JNU, from English and Persian and visual arts. So one of the things that comes out ties with the theme of the conference is that we're talking about confluence in all these 3 presentations. In Madhuri's presentation, we saw how the Shukta Saptasati has been taken up in the Arabic Persian tradition as well, and how it ties into a larger frame tradition of narratives which traveled from across the Arabic world to Italy later on, and then to India as well. It's pre-existent in India, as Madhuri already pointed out. So it's very interesting to look at these frame narratives and how the form also in a way informs the content, how there's a framing of certain patriarchal mode also in it. And like Madhuri rightly pointed out, colonial gaze is different, but these frames of the East, if I may so say, there's a parrot framing. A parrot is a sort of a sutradhar, and there's a framing of the woman's narrative, but there's also an agency available with the woman to break free by ringing the parrot's neck in various narratives, if I've understood it well. So there is a sort of subversive agency latent in these narratives. Shubham's presentation was also very interesting. It draws out the trajectory of Persian poetry in India right from the time of Amir Khusro up to the time of Bahadur Shah Zafar. Sorry. And then he got a little time to talk about Instagram and the democratization of poetry through a digital medium. It'll be interesting to see what kind of poetry is posted on social media. Is it the surface love poetry, Does it cut deeper? But nonetheless, it's proliferation of knowledge, and this is how knowledge systems keep reinventing themselves through media and the resurgence of it. And Hare Krishnan's presentation also a brilliant visual exposition of questioning the idea of modernity itself as a watertight category, in pointing out how this particular case study of Trikuna Sasta Kshetram is not in the Kerala Dravid style, but has several influences. And Kerala was, of course, trading a lot with the Middle East, and there's European influences, and so on and so forth. And so he has questioned the idea of modernity itself, and how the category of modernity, and how these influences of globalization were preeminent even in the 14th century, and so on. So I open the forum now for discussion. If anybody has comments or questions for any of the three speakers, you're most welcome. Thank you.
Rajan, no time. Amit?
Yes, sir,
no
please.
time. No
Okay.
time for discussion. We have already started late.
So if anybody has questions or comments, please post it on the chat, or you could email the presenters. And thanks to all the three presenters, and we should reconvene for the next session. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to all the presenters.
So, Rindon, we go to the next session.
Yes, sir.
Please invite Sucharita.
Welcome to Professor Sucharita Chattopadhyay. She is currently the Professor in Comparative Literature and Coordinator, Center for Canadian Studies, Jadavpur University, Calcutta. She has been the President of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute for the period between 2016 and 2017. Her research interests are Indigenous Canadian literature, Canadian immigrant literature, comparative study of Indian and Southeast Asian literatures, translation of Indian literatures into English. She is also the principal investigator for project on locating indigeneity in the Global South Revival Conservation Sustainability at Jadavpur University under the RUSA 2.0 scheme of the university. She is an EC member of the CLAI. Professor Chattopadhyay has contributed to many journals and anthologies of critical essays and is also a prolific translator. She is currently editing a series of anthologies of critical essays on comparative literature from different Indian languages in English translation, and has also been commissioned to write a short history of Canadian literature by Orion Blackstone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and a very good afternoon to all of you. I have three presenters in this session. The first presenter is Ritoma Bosha. The title of her paper is 2.5 Letters of Love, Rereading the Sufi Bhakti Landscape of South Asia. The second speaker would be Swasti Sharma. The title of her paper is Gendering Syncretism, a Comparative Study of Mirabai and Makfi. And the third speaker is Syed Shah Marhunul Irshad Al-Qadri. The title of the paper is Tagore Ke Arabi Tarajam. Now, may I request all the speakers to introduce themselves and mention their current affiliation before they start reading their papers. The first speaker is Ritoma. We are running a bit late, so I think the paper readers, it would be good if you can finish within 12 minutes. That would leave us with some time for discussion. I know you are probably ready with a longer one, but do try to finish within 12 minutes. Ritoma, over to you. Introduce yourself and go on to present your paper.
Thank you, Sucharita. A very good afternoon to everyone. This is Ritoma Bashak. I'm currently pursuing my MPhil from the Department of Modern
Ritoma,
India.
can you be a bit louder?
Yeah, sorry. Is this okay now? Yeah,
this is better.
So I am an MPhil scholar at DU, at the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies. So my paper is, as Sucharita has already mentioned, it's 2.5 Letters of Love, revisiting the Sufi Bhakti landscape. So I would like to begin by talking about the term landscape, because it talks about the landscape and the languages, language both in its linguistic sense and also in the sense of language being the mode of expression. So how the Sufi Bhakti seepages have shaped South Asia as a space, as a cognitive and affective space. I would like to present, if I may. I'm not sure how this is. Yeah. So is this visible?
Yes, it is.
So first, I will be talking about the space, the space that pre-modern, what I refer to as the space of South Asia in this context is pre-modern South Asia, is a part of the Perso-Arabic trajectory. And this has to do with the Silk Route, right from the 3rd century, as we know, and the entire span of connected histories of the shared past. I'll not spend a lot of time here. So what I mean by the Perso-Arabic space over here in South Asia is a part of that Perso-Arabic space stretches right from Syria to right up to Bangladesh. So I'll just move quickly to the main section of my paper. So there is this proven evidence that Islam was in contact with South Asia, and then you have the Sufi and the Bhakti seepages. But my question in this paper is not to repeat it, but to address the question of the untranslatable, as it is associated with the notion of Islamic spirituality, and how that untranslatable spiritual knowledge or spiritual understanding is actually in many ways quote-unquote translated, transcreated, and it reaches South Asia and is recontextualized within the land itself. So I'll not go into the controversies regarding whether the Quran Sharif can be translated or whether there are other modes of acquiring Islamic spirituality, but I would rather focus on the example of South Asia as a case study of receiving from Islamic spirituality and the framing of Sufism. And I would also like to mention how Sufism is different in South Asia. I would not go into how it is different, but how Sufism itself, being a very curious case itself in relation to Islam, how that attains an even more curious form when it enters South Asia. We would rather go into that. So the notion of the cosmopolis, as Pollock has also suggested in talking about the Sanskrit cosmopolis, is very much is something that we are aware of. But locating South Asia within the Persianate cosmopolis leads to some other questions, and the recent coinage, that is vernacular cosmopolitanism, as Catherine Hansen mentions in her recent paper, not very recent, 2010, Who Wants to Be a Cosmopolitan? So by vernacular cosmopolitanism, I would like, going by this idea, I would like to locate how Sufi Bhakti how Sufism in a direct relationship with Islam and as a part of the Perso-Arabic domain of cognitive and affective analysis, reception, trajectories, how that is in contact with South Asia and how that is shaping South Asia in vernaculars. So we are also aware of the iconic evidence of intertextuality in this particular verse, Zehale Miski Makun Tagaful. This has been a much discussed verse. I've been hearing about this in the past sessions. So I'll not go into the fact that it is one line in Persian and the other in Hindi. But what is interesting over here is that Amir Khusru, a lot of verses are attributed to Amir Khusru which are in Hindi, but there's little evidence of whether those are actually by Amir Khusru himself. But this has a pretty good evidential basis. So my point over here is that the moment when these oral content was being recorded, it was recorded in the Nastaliq script, in the Persian-Arabic script, but it also had the Hindavi lines. So it was a fluid, as we know, a fluid interaction of languages facilitated by contact with Sufism. I would like to mention Bulle Shah in Punjabi because I've already mentioned the reception of the Persian-Arabic poetics in general and how that is shaping and developing a new poetic aesthetics for South Asia and also a new aesthetics of framing spirituality in South Asia. So I would like to take Bulle Shah's example. And the Malfuzat again was primarily, the first recording was again primarily in the Shahmukhi script. And even if you look at the language Punjabi, it is a language with two different scripts. But this text, I'm interested in this particular poem for more reasons than one, not just because of the script, the Shahmukhi and the Gurmukhi thing, but also because of the content. So now I would like to enter the question of content vis-a-vis the Sufi Bhakti seepages and vis-a-vis the relationship of South Asia, position of South Asia within the Persian-Arabic paradigm. Here we see in this particular verse, if you take it as a case study, he is Bulle Shah or the Sufi poet, if I can say that, is rejecting every cultural, social, linguistic, religious markers of identification. I have already said or claimed the relationship, the inevitable relationship of Islam definitely with Sufism, but also with Bhakti. The very idea of Tawheed, the core of Islamic spirituality, of a casteless, quote-unquote non-sectarian, this can also be debated, quote-unquote non-sectarian mode of worshipping the Lord, not the beloved, the Lord who is in a high pedestal. So that has already been established, and those who are aware of the Sufi verses can actually link the trajectory how Islam is related to Sufism, and can also probably argue that similar spiritual quest is also extended within the Bhakti domain. But here there is a direct rejection of these terms. Momin meaning Muslim. Now, Momin, which Masita in Punjabi, it means, I'm sorry, I could not provide a translation over here. I can translate the lines that I'm talking about. Masita is masjid, so I'm not a Muslim inside a masjid. I'm not a kufr diarita. So I am not someone who follows the rituals and of the kafirs. Na me paka vich palita. I am not the pure amidst the impure. So here the concept of purity, impurity are central to the notion of institutionalized religion. Pak, na pak. These are very central to institutionalized Islam. Na me andar ved kitaba. So this is coming from a very nuanced understanding of the land, Punjab, the undivided Punjab, where this is being uttered. So you are already aware of the many of the pluralities in terms of religion present, and it's like a very nuanced kind of utterance that I am neither this nor that, and the way it is in a very politically nuanced way, as it is also claimed that Sufism is not just spiritual but a socio-political political position. So once you are rejecting this, you're also rejecting that. So breaking duality. So non-duality here becomes almost a term that one can get obsessed with while looking into the Bhakti and the Sufi, because it keeps recurring and it keeps occurring in so many dimensions, and it suggests so many meanings. The very term non-duality can suggest so many meanings. As we look at it, can suggest non-sectarianism, it can suggest a way where you can ask for sabki khair, as Kabir says, the welfare of everybody. So neither this nor that. It can also suggest the oneness of the God, Tawheed. So it can assume many meanings in this context. And he also rejects the geographical associations. That does not mean that he rejects the space where he's talking about, but he redefines the space. He redefines affiliation of the space itself. So he says that I'm not Arabi, I'm not Lahori, I'm not Hindi, Nagari, I'm not Hindu or Turk. So here Hindu refers to those living near the river Indus, as we can see. Lastly, he says, Name Adam Havva Jaya. Now, Adam Havva Jaya, this is not something that all Sufis reject. Adam Havva is the children of Adam and Eve. So he's rejecting even that. So who is he? He is concluding it by saying, I don't know who I am. So it is not that he's saying that he is not a human being. The child of Adam and Eve suggests human being. But he's rejecting the bookish. He's tracing it to the bookish knowledge of human beings as the children of Adam and Eve, and he's rejecting that knowledge. So a rejection of the bookish knowledge. From that, I would directly go to Kabir, who has directly claimed the rejection of bookish knowledge, saying that Pothi padi padi jag mohi pandit bhayo na koi. So it's like 2.5 letters of love. Dhai aakhar prem ki. So here love is assuming a radical form which has the capacity, the agency to absolutely disassociate with age-old traditions, age-old sectarianism. So this can be linked with, in a very interesting way, to the concept of Tawheed in Islamic spirituality, that there is oneness of God. So if there is oneness of God, then what? Then everyone is equal in the eyes of God. If everyone is equal in the eyes of God, then love is free, and love seems a radical. We are getting to hear the idea of radical love even in the recent works on Nanak. The question of radical love has been raised. So love as not a futile emotion, but as something with an agency of its own. And it can also be very interestingly linked to Islamic spirituality, which is apparently disassociating with the notions of non-institutionalization. But is it actually impossible to draw from Islamic spirituality within a non-institutionalized or disinstitutionalized space? That is the question that I want to ask in this paper, and I want to explore. Sabki Khair, as I already said, asking for welfare beyond communal religious barriers. And also Kabir claims that Kashi Kaaba ek hai, Khairam Rahim. I have already talked about the nuanced the ways of possibilities of understanding the term non-duality in more ways than one. Now, as I've already mentioned, what could be translated from the Islamic spirituality? I'll take Amir Khusru's verse. Again, the Malfuzat was in Persian-Arabic script. Here it says, Kafir ishqa Musulmani maradar kindness. My Persian is not very good. Pardon. So he says that I am an infidel in love. I don't need Islam. So what is this Islam that he is rejecting? Is he disassociating Sufism from Islamic spirituality? Or is he trying to say something else? In this paper, I would argue, and also this is the evidence, as he says that he goes on to use the term kafir, the term infidel, which is associated with the napak, non-pure, impure arenas of life in the Quran Sharif itself. So it says that kafir ishqam Musulmani maradar khanst. I am an infidel in love. So here he is not focusing on the term kafir. He is not literally saying that he is a non-believer, but he is saying that he is a believer of love. He is a believer in love. So love itself assumes a certain domain where it can assert a certain agency. Then he goes on to say, as I've already said, rejection in any possibility of polarization. He's rejecting that. The next line says, that every vein of my body has come alive. I don't need the girdle of the Brahmin. So if he's rejecting this institutionalization, he's also rejecting that. And by this constant rejection of dualities, polarities, a new understanding of the South Asian space, the cognitive and affective space is developing, which is anyway beyond any duality, which is anyway beyond any polarization. Because once it has been said that neither this nor that do I want in this particular space, it is perhaps not possible to polarize it conceptually if you understand the effectivity of the situation.
12 minutes are over. Could you just sum up now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So I'll just quickly go into the fact that Amir Khusru So Amir Khusru and Mirabai, I've already talked about the Sufi Bhakti seepages, how what has been received from Islamic spirituality, the concept of Tawheed and oneness, is being expressed in the local indigenous imageries like Panghat, imageries like, and also if you look at the verses, certain resemblances between Khusro and Mirabai's verse, because Khusro says that I need nothing but the sight of the beloved. Mirabai also says that Mira ki peer mitegi jad Bed Savariya hoy in Rajasthani. Bed is the doctor. So it's absolutely the same content being expressed in many languages, and this journey is basically a journey towards Fanafi Allah, which is being contextualized within the space of South Asia. And this is a very interesting point that I'll just quickly, if I have 2 more minutes, I'll just wrap it up.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, thank you. So, the concept of the mad lover, the divana, that has always been reused and reuttered within the space. If you look at the reuttering of the indigenous narratives, how the quote unquote secular, the indigenous narratives were transformed into the sacred, be it here Ranja Soni Mahewal, and how these elements of sacrifice, longing, fana, baka, these were again received during the independence, during the struggle of independence, when Faiz, Habib Jalib, they were talking of separation, they were talking of the pain of the struggle for independence, so they were borrowing from this, and this very controversial nazm, which basically lists from Mansoor Hallaj to all the other cases, Sasi Punuhi, Ranja, cases of separation, cases of sacrifice for something that we believe in. So the idea that we are ready to sacrifice our lives for something we believe in is very, very integral to the notion of dissent in South Asia. So I would argue that it is the Hallaj matter which has helped to develop the language of dissent in South Asia, be it Faiz claiming Hum Dekhenge during the independence period, or be it the reception and reutterance of Faiz in contemporary times during framing contemporary resistance to homogeneous hegemonic claims. As we know that it has been translated in so many Indian bhashas, it has been performed, and it has been there in slogans, posters across borders. So that is how it has traveled, if you look at it, from the Hallaj matter. Even Habib Jalib's anti-authoritarian verse in Zia-ul-Haq Era in Pakistan says that maybe Mansoor hu keh do Hallaj se, I too am Mansoor. So this, I would argue, is a question of revisibilization of the many margins within South Asia, tracing it back to a recontextualization of Islam, a recontextualization of spirituality, which has rejected the possibilities of dualities and in any sort of sectarianism within the land itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritoma. We'll reserve the questions and suggestions and observations till the end of the session. I invite Swasti Sharma to present her paper. Swasti, would you please introduce yourself first, mention your affiliation, and then go on to present your paper? And 12 minutes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sucharita Chattopadhyay. I shall now begin by presenting the screen.
Please introduce yourself also,
yes,
Swasti.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Swasti Sharma. I teach in the Department of English, Satyavati College, University of Delhi. And let me just begin by saying that I'm grateful to the members of the organizing committee of this conference for giving me an opportunity to present my research paper. Let me begin by sharing a brief anecdote. The core idea behind this paper was conceived when I came across John Stratton Hawley's book titled A Storm of Songs. The very first chapter is The Bhakti Movement and Its Discontents. Hawley begins with these lines, and I quote, "The Bhakti archive of India, its corpus of vernacular religious songs, ready to be sung at any moment, provides the country with a sense of shared richness that has no peer. Individual gems of Sanskrit poetry may be cut finer, but the vernacular bhakti digs deeper into the national soul." Unquote. Despite numerous gaps and silences within the movement itself, it is the unifying potential of the movement that remains essential to the aesthetic integration of India. In fact, Hawley goes on to validate the aforementioned observation. quote, in Hindi, a distinction is commonly made between Nirgun and Sagun aspects of Bhakti poetry, that is, without attributes and with attributes. These terms derive from a long-standing theological contrast between the two ways of conceiving divinity, apophatic and world-infusing, and the contrasting stances that devotees must cultivate to approach the deity in these very different modes. In regard to Bhakti poetry, however, the contrast comes to have a related meaning, a contrast between a poetry of ordinary life, that is attributeless, and the poetry that is situated itself in the charmed realm of divine play or Leela. Stories of how Ram and Sita, Krishna and Radha, Shiva and Shakti, or a host of other divine figures live their lives for a time as earthly beings. Bhakti poets speaking in every major language have piped into these Leelas, creating a polyglot repository of devotional story that can be heard from one end of the country to other. Similarly, James Fadiman and Robert Fraser underscored a binding force in Sufism. In essential Sufism, they assert, and I quote, the three modes of union with the divine turn up in every religious tradition, and all three are present in Sufism. One of these is ecstatic. It requires a special visitation that lifts the soul out of its body. Ex, out, station, to stand, ecstasis, to stand outside oneself, and transport it to a higher, distinctly different level of consciousness in which the paper will operate. Beginning with Mirabai's verse, which has been translated by John Stratton Hawley. My dark one has gone to an alien land. He has left me, never returned. He's never sent me a single word. So I have stripped off my ornaments, jewels and adornments, cut my hair from my head, and put on holy garments, all on his account, seeking him in all four directions. Mira, unless she meets the dark one, her lord, she doesn't even want to live. Notice the fervor. Now you will notice the fervor in the verse of Makfi, which was translated by Sally Lee Stewart, Elena Bell, and Maksuda Zuraiva. You with the dark curly hair and the breathtaking eyes, your inquiring glance that leaves me undone, eyes that pierce and then withdraw like a blood-stained sword, eyes with dagger lashes. Zealots, you are mistaken, this is heaven. Two questions emerge to the fore. What triggered the ubiquitous equanimity in the compositions of these two women poets? And number two, how did their gender define their self-positioning? Let me now iterate the statement of purpose. Bhakti and Sufi movements pioneered a renaissance in the contemplation of socio-religious values. Saints from both the avant-garde maneuvers proposed a more egalitarian restructuring of the society. Rejecting the status quo, they preached. They also served practice. Chief among the emancipated women Bhakti mystics was Mirabai, whose bhajans, that is, the devotional hymns, reverberated her rebellion against gender performativity. The feminist Avala Lettre denounced rigid social institutions and embraced spiritual release. Similarly, Makfi literally means hidden one, also rejected traditional gender roles in favor of Sufi concept of love in her poems. The research paper will primarily study the intersection of gender politics and religious beliefs in the devotional poetry of the aforementioned Bhakti and Sufi women poets respectively. The paper will furnish the genealogical assessment of the characteristics of the two movements. Through a comparative framework and close textual analysis, poets in repudiation of hegemonic patriarchal hierarchy, the idiosyncratic subalternity of mystic verses produced by Mirabai and Makfi is an ancillary concern that would. After this brief statement of purpose, let me now elaborate on the first aspect of my paper, that is the teleologies of Bhakti and Sufi movements. As this pointed out, there were several major forms of Bhakti movement which have been divided of devotees. Raw emotion